My name is Charlene. On the day I graduated, my own mother leaned forward and whispered, "You shame us." That single sentence cut me out of the family for 12 long years. While they erased me from photos and rewrote my story, I was sleeping in motels, clutching a diploma that meant nothing. But here I am now, living in the mansion they once dreamed of, and suddenly they're at my door, pretending nothing ever happened. What do you think I did when they said, "This house is too big for you alone"? The auditorium was packed, and the air was thick with excitement. Families leaned forward in their seats, craning their necks to capture a glimpse of their children as names were called. Cameras flashed like bursts of lightning, filling the room with a rhythm of artificial stars. The smell of fresh flowers carried through the air, mixed with the faint scent of hairspray and freshly pressed robes. This was the kind of moment every American family looks forward to. Graduation day, a rite of passage meant to mark the beginning of adulthood. I was only 18, the youngest daughter in my family, and I had dreamed of this moment since the first time I saw my older sister walk across that same stage years earlier. My robe felt heavy on my shoulders, but it was a weight I carried proudly. All I wanted was to hear my mother say she was proud, maybe catch her smile in the crowd, and know that, for one moment, I had done something right. Graduation is not the end, it's the beginning. I had heard our principal quote from Senator Orrin Hatch earlier that morning. I clung to those words like a lifeline. If this was the beginning, then maybe the years of struggle, the long nights of studying alone, the quiet sacrifices I had made, would finally mean something. But as I scanned the sea of faces, my mother's expression told another story. Dimity sat stiffly in her chair, lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. My sister whispered something in her ear, and both shook their heads slightly. My excitement dimmed just a little, but I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe she would soften when my name was called. When the announcer finally said, "Charlene Williams," my heart raced like it was trying to outrun every doubt I had ever carried. The applause echoed, but my ears strained for one sound only, my family cheering. Instead, I saw my mother's cold, unmoving face. I stepped onto the stage, the diploma waiting in the principal's hands. My legs shook, but I forced a smile, lifting my chin as if I belonged in that moment. And then, as I reached out to take the diploma, my mother's voice cut through the noise. "You shame us!" She didn't shout, but the words carried, loud enough for the families sitting nearby to hear, loud enough that I saw a few heads turn and eyes widen. The applause faltered around me, like air sucked out of the room. A laugh from a distant row covered the silence, but it didn't matter. My mother's words had already done their work. For a second, I thought I misheard her. My hands trembled as I clutched the diploma, the paper suddenly heavier than the robe on my shoulders. I looked down at her, desperate for some sign it was a mistake, that I had imagined the malice. But her eyes were steady, and her lips didn't move again. The silence was worse than the words themselves. A teacher stepped forward, microphone in hand, ready for me to say a few words of gratitude. For a fleeting second, I thought about speaking, telling the crowd that despite everything, I had made it. But before the mic could reach me, my mother stood and pulled my arm lightly, just enough to stop me. Her grip was firm, a silent command to keep quiet. I froze, and the teacher awkwardly handed the microphone to the next student. Inside my head, a single thought screamed, "Family is supposed to lift you up, not push you down." I had read that phrase once in a library book, and now it stung with cruel irony. My legs wobbled as I walked off the stage. Around me, families cheered for their sons and daughters. Mothers wiped tears, fathers clapped proudly, siblings whistled. The sound rose like a tide of celebration. My family, meanwhile, gathered their things. My sister turned her face away as if ashamed to be seen near me. My mother rose first, smoothing her dress, her mouth set in a line of finality. I clutched my diploma so hard the edges bent. Every step I took felt like a spotlight was on me, exposing me as the one who didn't belong. Teachers saw it, classmates saw it. No one said a word. I caught one teacher's eyes as I passed him. He gave me the faintest look of pity, but he didn't move, didn't speak. Not one adult, those who always preached about compassion, about protecting students, intervened. Their silence carved into me deeper than my mother's words. Sometimes silence cuts deeper than words. I learned that truth right there, still in my cap and gown. By the time the ceremony ended, I was numb. The chatter of classmates around me blurred, voices rising and falling like static. I heard snippets. What happened? Why didn't her mom clap? Did she do something wrong? The whispers trailed me like shadows. When I turned to find my family, they were already walking toward the exit. No waiting for photos, no congratulations, no hug, just their backs disappearing through the crowd. I wanted to run after them, to demand why, to scream that I had worked as hard as anyone else. But my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I stood frozen, my diploma pressed against my chest, the only acknowledgement I would receive that day. Classmates passed by, some avoiding my eyes, others sneaking glances filled with curiosity or pity. A girl I had studied with once whispered to her friend, "What did she do?" The words stung because they carried the assumption that I must have deserved it. I told myself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. My father once told me, "Dignity is when you keep standing even after someone tries to break your knees." He wasn't here anymore, but his words lived in me. I inhaled, squared my shoulders, and walked out of the auditorium with as much calm as I could muster. That day, I realized graduation wasn't my beginning, it was my exile. When I walked back home from the ceremony, the diploma pressed against my chest like a fragile shield, I convinced myself the silence in the car ride was just exhaustion. Families get tired after hours of sitting in stiff chairs, I told myself. Maybe the celebration would start once we were back inside the house. I imagined balloons taped to the kitchen wall, the smell of my favorite casserole warming in the oven, maybe even a small cake. That's what other families did. Graduation dinners were a tradition, a way of saying, "We saw you, we're proud." But when I stepped through the door, the air felt wrong. The chairs in the dining room were neatly arranged, but the table was bare. No plates, no food, not even a jug of iced tea sweating on the counter. My siblings stood close to my mother, whispering, their eyes darting to me and then away like I was a stranger who had wandered in uninvited. The television was off, the curtains half drawn, as though the house itself had decided not to celebrate. Home is supposed to be the one place that welcomes you back, not shuts you out. That thought hit me so hard I nearly staggered. I set my diploma carefully on the counter, waiting for someone to speak, for my mother to break into a smile and tell me she'd only been testing me earlier. Instead, she turned her chair to face me fully, her back perfectly straight, her expression colder than the marble floor beneath her. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone," she said, her voice flat, each word clipped. "You are no longer part of this family." The sentence landed like a blow to my stomach. My mouth opened, but for a second no sound came out. Finally, I managed, "For what? For receiving a diploma? For existing?" My brother and sister stood behind her, silent statues, their eyes averted, complicit by their stillness. The betrayal was not in their words, but in their refusal to speak any. My mother reached for the photo album that had been left on the coffee table. She pulled out a recent family picture, one where we were all dressed for church. Without hesitation, she picked up a pair of scissors. The snip echoed through the room as she cut my image out cleanly, her movements precise, surgical. That sound of scissors on paper was louder than any slap. I wanted to scream, to grab the photo and tear the entire album apart. But I stood still, forcing myself to memorize the moment. If this was what exile looked like, I wanted to remember it in detail. "You will not appear in family records, not in gatherings, not in our home," she continued, as if she were a judge reading a sentence. "You are erased." A wave of disbelief swept over me. For a moment, I heard Eleanor Roosevelt's words in my mind. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And yet here I was, being cut out of my own history. I steadied my breathing. As much as her cruelty hurt, I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Deep inside, something small and defiant sparked. This wouldn't be the final chapter. The days that followed proved how thorough her erasure would be. By Monday, rumors had already taken on a life of their own. A friend called me from school, her voice nervous. "People are saying you stormed out of the ceremony, that you made a scene. They said your mom had to calm everyone down." I pressed the phone to my ear, stunned. "That's not what happened," I whispered, but she didn't answer right away. "I know," she said softly at last, "but that's what people are hearing." It hit me then. My mother wasn't just cutting me out of photos. She was rewriting the story entirely. She was turning me from the quiet daughter who had endured her silence into the villain who ruined her family's reputation. By the time the yearbook committee met, my erasure was official. My name was removed from the honor students page. The explanation they gave: "Your family declined permission." The sight of that blank space where my photo should have been stung worse than any rumor. It's one thing to lose your home. It's another to lose your history. I walked through the halls of the school that week, my eyes drawn again and again to the trophy case. There, the achievements of my classmates glittered under fluorescent lights. My name, once penciled in on a list of academic awards, had been scraped off. A clean slate, as though I'd never been there at all. Shock hardened into something else, anger simmering, sharp and steady. If they thought they could erase me, they underestimated the quiet power of memory. I vowed, right there, in that hallway, that they would not be the final authors of my story. I began keeping a journal, writing down everything: the words my mother had spoken, the sound of the scissors, the sting of the rumors. I tucked extra copies of my diploma away in hidden spots. Proof of self. In America, many estranged children keep tokens like that, a shield against erasure, evidence that their lives are real, even if family denies them. That night, as I closed the journal and slid it under my pillow, the truth settled in. I hadn't just lost a family. I had lost the right to be remembered. The words, "You are erased," still echoed in my ears as I stepped out of the house, clutching the diploma and the small bag I had thrown together in haste. The sun had already sunk behind the Cleveland rooftops, leaving only a dim orange trail in the sky. Streetlights flickered on, buzzing faintly. My shoes scuffed against the sidewalk as I walked with no real destination. The neighborhood I had grown up in suddenly felt foreign, like I was trespassing on ground that no longer wanted me. Neighbors watering their lawns or pulling trash bins to the curb noticed me, but they said nothing. Their eyes slid away, some with disapproval, some with indifference. In American suburbs, silence can be as sharp as judgment. The kind of silence that says, "We know, but we won't get involved." It made me feel as if I had been marked with a scarlet letter everyone could see. I thought about calling a friend, maybe asking if I could stay the night. My phone felt heavy in my hand. But pride and shame fought inside me, and shame won. What would I say? "My family cut me out. Can I borrow your couch?" No, I couldn't bear to hear the hesitation in their voice. I pushed the phone back into my pocket. Sometimes the loneliest step is the one that takes you away from the people who should have loved you. That step, the one I took away from my mother's door, was heavier than anything I had ever carried. Eventually, I found myself standing before a weathered motel off Route 20, its neon sign sputtering, "Vacancy." The red glow flickered across my face as cars roared past on the nearby road. I hesitated, staring at the cracked parking lot, the peeling paint. It wasn't home, but it was open. Inside, the smell of stale smoke and disinfectant hit me all at once. The lobby was dim, its carpet worn thin. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up from his television. "Single room?" he asked, not even bothering to hide his disinterest. "Yes," I whispered, sliding over a few crumpled bills. He pushed a key toward me without another word. I felt like a number, a transaction, nothing more. Carrying my bag down the narrow hallway, I unlocked the door to a room that smelled faintly of mildew and cigarettes. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper curling in the corners. Outside, the neon light buzzed relentlessly. I set my father's photo on the bedside table, the frame slightly chipped but precious beyond measure. He had been the only one who ever made me feel seen, and even though he was gone, I needed him in that room. Sitting on the creaky bed, I pulled out my journal. The pages felt blank in a way my life did not. My hand shook as I wrote, "This paper diploma means nothing tonight, but one day it will." The words steadied me, a fragile declaration that I wouldn't let tonight define me forever. Despair pressed on me, losing my family, facing the fear of tomorrow. But beneath it, a flicker of determination. I remembered reading a line once, "Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life." J.K. Rowling's words gave me a strange kind of hope. If this was my bottom, then maybe it could also be my foundation. The night stretched long, with the sound of cars outside, the hum of the neon, and muffled voices in the next room. Still, I told myself, survival meant moving forward, even if it was just through tonight. By morning, I needed money for the next night, so I walked to a diner down the road, the kind with chrome stools and sticky menus, and asked if they needed extra help. The manager, harried and exhausted, glanced me over. "You can bus tables, cash at the end of the shift. Interested?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. The work was menial, wiping crumbs, stacking dishes, carrying trays. My hands smelled of grease and soap, but every hour I worked felt like defiance against the narrative my mother had written for me. Then came the whispers. A group of younger co-workers leaning against the counter smirked as I passed. One of them, barely older than me, said with mock concern, "Didn't your mom say you embarrassed them?" Guess she was right. His friends snickered. My throat tightened, but I forced myself not to react. I stacked plates quietly, pretending I hadn't heard. Inside, though, something hardened. Their voices repeated my mother's words like an echo chamber, but I knew I had to build a new voice, one they couldn't mimic. In America's small workplaces, gossip spreads faster than spilled coffee. By the end of the shift, everyone seemed to know my story, twisted and retold. It was humiliating, but it also fueled me. If they thought their whispers would break me, they were wrong. That night, I returned to the motel room exhausted. I lay on the narrow bed, listening to traffic outside, the sound of a couple arguing 2 doors down, and the buzz of the old air conditioner. I felt the weight of abandonment pressing down, but I refused to let tears fall where anyone could see them. I pulled my diploma close, clutching it like a shield against total erasure. They could erase me from photos, from yearbooks, from conversations, but not from the truth I carried in my hands. That night, I learned you could lose everything, your family, your home, your place in the world, except the decision to keep standing. And as I stared at the ceiling of that dingy room, I knew this would not be my last night in places like this, but it would be the start of something bigger. This exile would not be the end. It would be the seed of my fight back. The days after my first night in that motel stretched out like an endless gray road. I tried to carry myself upright when I walked through the neighborhood, but each step reminded me I no longer had a place there. People who had once waved warmly now only nodded with tight smiles. Some offered a stiff hello as they passed, but I caught the way their voices dropped once they thought I was out of earshot. It wasn't kindness. It was politeness layered over discomfort. One afternoon, as I crossed the corner near the grocery store, I overheard a woman leaning into her friend. "That's the girl who shamed her family at graduation," she whispered, her words sharp enough to cut through the air. I kept walking, my skin burning as though I'd been branded. The sting wasn't just that they were talking, it was that my private pain had become gossip traded like currency. In America, reputations travel faster than facts, and mine was already out of my hands. I repeated to myself a phrase I'd read once. "What other people think is none of my business, but my heart knew better. Words follow you, whether you want them to or not." By the end of the week, I had started my first steady job at a small diner on the edge of town. My uniform was borrowed from the manager's niece, still smelling faintly of detergent. The work was straightforward. Brew coffee, serve pie, keep the counter clean. But in that glass-walled diner, I was always on display. Customers recognized me. Some whispered behind menus, others avoided my section altogether. A group of teenagers laughed too loudly, glancing in my direction as they pushed French fries around their plates. Their mocking eyes said more than their words ever could. One evening, as I poured coffee for a man in a suit, a coworker leaned close and smirked. "Heard your mama kicked you out. Must have been real bad." His tone was casual, like he was remarking on the weather, but the jab struck deep. I steadied my hand and set the pot back on the burner. My chest burned, but I forced a smile for the next customer. If I had learned anything, it was that public humiliation could strip you bare, but how you carried yourself afterward was its own kind of armor. In diners like this, gossip traveled faster than the coffee refills. It wasn't just the customers, it was the staff, the regulars, the delivery drivers. Being that girl meant I couldn't hide. I was always on stage, my mistakes rewritten and exaggerated in whispers. They wanted me to crumble in public, I wrote later in my journal. Instead, I learned how to smile through the storm. Malcolm Forbes once said, "Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you." I repeated that line in my head during each shift, reminding myself that while others mocked, I could still choose dignity. One afternoon, while wiping down a counter, I noticed a woman I hadn't seen before. Middle-aged, with kind eyes and a plain cardigan, she ordered a slice of apple pie and coffee. She watched me move through the diner, and when I brought her the check, she slid a bill across the table, more than double the cost. As I thanked her, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "Don't let small minds define your future." For a moment I couldn't speak. Her words landed differently than the whispers. They didn't cut. They lifted. She smiled gently. "Libraries are free, honey. Go learn. Go build. Don't you dare stop here." That night, her words stayed with me long after I left the diner. Sometimes a stranger's kindness feels more like family than blood ever did. I copied her sentence into my journal, writing it under the photo of my father. The combination of his memory and her voice steadied me. When my shift ended that evening, I stepped into the dusk. The sky glowed purple, and though the whispers still followed me in the streets, something inside had shifted. My silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. To observe, to endure, to plan. Whispers fade. But so do excuses. I wasn't going to stay erased. That night, as I walked home, I decided this would be the last time I let the words of others dictate my worth. A few weeks after those first nights in the motel, I scraped together enough cash to rent a room in a sagging old house on the east side of Cleveland. The paint peeled off its siding, the porch sagged a little in the middle, and the hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage, but it was mine. The landlord didn't ask too many questions. He just wanted cash on the first of the month, and I wanted 4 walls and a lock on the door. I carried my single bag upstairs, set it down beside a narrow bed, and thought, this is where I begin again. One afternoon, while running errands downtown, I ducked into a small corner shop to buy a notebook and some cheap pens. At the counter, the owner, an older man with glasses sliding down his nose, rang me up. He handed me a receipt that didn't match the total I'd just calculated in my head. I paused, checked the math, and pointed it out gently. I think you added the tax twice. He blinked, adjusted his glasses, then chuckled. Well, look at that. You're right. Something in his face changed. Curiosity? Maybe respect? You good with numbers? I shrugged. I helped balance my dad's accounts when he was alive. Just basic stuff. He leaned forward. I could use someone a few hours a week. Nothing fancy, just bookkeeping. It won't pay much, but it's steady. I felt the air shift inside me. An unexpected door had opened. I'll take it, I said without hesitation. As I walked out, receipt in hand, I thought, opportunity doesn't always knock. Sometimes it's left ajar, waiting for you to push through. This time, I pushed. At the shop, I learned to balance ledgers, to track invoices, to recognize when suppliers were padding their numbers. My coworkers snickered now and then, whispering about how the boss had taken pity on me. I ignored them. Being underestimated was an advantage. It meant nobody saw me coming. The first paycheck was modest, 2 crisp bills folded neatly in an envelope. To anyone else, it would have been forgettable. To me, it was proof that I could stand without leaning on anyone. With that money, I bought a second-hand coffee maker from a thrift store. I called it my independence machine. Every morning when it sputtered and hissed, I felt like I was brewing my own survival, cup by cup. I remembered my mother's words, "You'll never manage without us." And every dollar I earned proved her wrong. The best revenge wasn't shouting back. It was survival, one paycheck at a time. Still, the silence of evenings pressed down on me. After long shifts, I came home to the squeak of the bed frame and the hum of the radiator. That was when the memories returned. My mother's voice at graduation, the cut of scissors through my image in the family photo. One night, I pulled out an old notebook that had once belonged to my father. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges, but the smell of ink and paper comforted me. I opened it, uncapped a pen, and began to write. I wrote about that day on the stage, the look on my mother's face, the way the world seemed to turn away with her. Then I wrote the vow I hadn't said aloud to anyone, that one day they would regret erasing me. I didn't mean revenge in the form of cruelty. I meant success so undeniable, so vast, that they couldn't pretend I didn't exist. Success is the best revenge. Frank Sinatra had said it, and I copied the quote in big letters at the top of the page. Underneath, I detailed my promise, to turn shame into strength, to rise higher than anyone expected, to build something that even silence could not ignore. That journal became my blueprint, not for anger, but for rebuilding. Each word was a brick, each vow a foundation stone. For the first time since being cast out, I felt control settling back into my hands. Quiet empowerment. I didn't tell anyone what I had written, didn't share the vow with friends or coworkers. It was my secret weapon, carried between the pages of a notebook no one else would read. Instead of replaying the humiliation in my mind, I replayed my plan. Step by step, I would outgrow the shadow they cast over me. I would make sure that every whisper, every rumor, every erasure would look small compared to what I would build. You don't have to shout your promise to the world, I wrote in the margins. Sometimes the loudest vow is the one you whisper to yourself. I closed the journal that night and slid it under my pillow, a private pact between me and the memory of my father. I didn't know how long it would take, or how many more nights I'd spend in silence, but I knew one thing for certain. This vow would guide every step I took. But even as I felt the spark of transformation, I sensed something waiting just around the corner. Failure wasn't done with me yet. It would test how badly I wanted to keep my promise. By the end of summer 2010, I had managed to build a fragile rhythm for myself. My paychecks from the shop and the diner never stretched far, but they gave me just enough to keep my room and buy groceries. Each time I walked home carrying a bag of food I had purchased with my own money, I felt a flicker of pride. But pride has a way of tempting you to believe you're ready for more, even before you truly are. I began to think I could break free from the cycle of small paychecks and whispered pity. Online, I read stories of young women flipping thrift store finds and secondhand clothes for real money. Pictures of their neat apartments and glowing reviews filled me with envy and possibility. Why not me? Why couldn't I take the scraps of my life and turn them into something valuable? I spent nights after work photographing clothes I'd collected from clearance racks and thrift bins. I posted them online with careful descriptions, refreshing the page every few minutes as if buyers would rush in the second they saw my listings. I imagined packages flying off my shelf, messages from satisfied customers, and an income steady enough to silence the voices that told me I would always fail. I thought maybe this was it, I wrote in my journal. My chance to finally break the cycle of shame. In America, side hustles are a rite of passage for struggling young adults. But for me, it wasn't just extra income. It was supposed to be the first true step toward proving my family wrong. And I placed too much hope on a fragile venture that hadn't even drawn its first breath. Weeks passed. The packages didn't move. The neatly folded clothes sat in a growing pile against my wall. I logged in every morning before work, praying for sales, but the screen stayed blank. Meanwhile, the bills came without fail. Shipping materials, internet costs, rent, all of it drained what little I had. Instead of building a business, I had dug myself into a hole. The money I thought I was investing turned into receipts I could barely face. One afternoon at the diner, exhaustion clung to me like sweat. My coworker leaned over as I scrubbed a table, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Guess your big business didn't take off, huh?" I forced myself to keep wiping, though my hands shook. My family's words echoed louder than his taunts. "You'll never make it." Every sneer, every rumor carried the same cruel chorus. Back in my room that night, I sat on the floor surrounded by unopened boxes. They were monuments of wasted hope, silent reminders of every misstep. I pressed my journal to my chest and finally let tears fall, muffled against the pages. I didn't cry for the money. I cried for the humiliation, the sick fear that maybe my mother's curse was true. "Failure isn't loud," I wrote with trembling hands. "It's the silence of bills on the counter and a phone that never rings." The room felt heavier than ever, shadows stretching across the peeling wallpaper. For a brief, bitter moment, I wondered if my vow in the journal had been naive, but life has a way of offering sparks in unlikely places. One day at the shop, I noticed the owner lugging out boxes of wilted plants. Their leaves drooped, brown edges curling. "Trash," he muttered, dropping them near the back door. Something struck me. I touched one of the stems gently. It wasn't brittle. It bent. Not dead, just tired. "Can I take these?" I asked. He looked at me as though I'd offered to carry out garbage. "If you want that trash, it's yours." So I carried them home, arms full of what others had already given up on. In my room, I set them near the window, watered their dry soil, trimmed the dead leaves. At first, nothing changed. They looked as hopeless as I felt. But I kept tending, whispering encouragement. I wasn't sure I believed in myself. Then one morning, I spotted it. Tiny green shoots breaking through. My heart jolted. Against neglect and odds, life had found its way back. If a plant can come back after being discarded, I thought, tears warming my eyes, maybe I could too. I placed the first revived plant next to my father's photo. The leaves reflected sunlight onto his face, a symbol of resilience I desperately needed. From then on, I looked at those plants differently. They weren't just greenery, they were metaphors, companions in survival. My family had thrown me away like I was nothing. And yet here I was, proving them wrong by breathing life into what the world had already labeled worthless. In America, people love stories of second chances. I realized I was living one, not just mine, but every plant I saved. I began to track their progress, filling my journal with notes. Today, I saved one. Tomorrow, I'll save 100. I understood then that my vow hadn't been empty. I just hadn't found the right path until now. Maybe failure wasn't the end, I wrote one night, watching the shadows of my revived plants stretch across the wall. Maybe it was just pruning before new growth. I didn't know it yet, but the same family who threw me out would one day see me bloom in ways they never believed possible. 2 years had passed since the night my mother cut me out of our family's story. 2 years of motel rooms, borrowed uniforms, and nights spent whispering my promise into a journal. Now, in the cramped apartment I rented on the second floor of a sagging duplex, I began to see signs that my silence was turning into strength. During the day, I worked in the corner shop, handling books and invoices like they were puzzle pieces only I could fit together. The owner relied on me more than he admitted. In the evenings, I returned to my small space, where pots of rescued plants lined the windowsills. Their green leaves stretched toward the light just as I did. The air smelled of soil and resilience. I kept to myself. No parties, no public chatter. I had learned that my silence was my armor, a shield against the whispers I could still feel lurking beyond the walls. Sometimes, the loudest success is the one you don't announce. I repeated Frank Ocean's words to myself often. Work hard in silence, let success make the noise. My life was still fragile, but it was mine. When I finally bought a used car, it felt like a revolution. The paint was faded and the muffler rattled, but the keys sat in my palm like a medal. In America, freedom often looks like 4 wheels and a full tank. No longer did I need rides. No longer did I pace at bus stops in the rain. Each small achievement was another stone laid in the foundation of independence, paying rent on time, cooking meals from scratch, managing bills without borrowing. At the shop, clients began to notice. One man grinned after I explained a billing error and said, "You run the books better than most managers." I smiled politely but kept it to myself. I didn't tell my family. I knew they would never acknowledge it. Independence, in my world, was measured not in applause, but in the absence of collapse. My car keys jingled in my hand each night, a talisman that reminded me I was driving forward, literally and figuratively. I was no longer the girl they erased. I was the woman they chose not to see. But then came the sting. One morning, I passed a newspaper stand downtown and froze. On the front page of the local section was a smiling face I knew too well. My sister, Aviana. She was being honored for her community involvement, her photo framed by words praising her leadership and character. My mother had clipped the article, photocopied it, and mailed it to relatives across the state. "This is what our family stands for," she had written in the margin. It wasn't enough to erase me. They needed someone else to shine in my absence. Seeing Aviana celebrated as the family's pride was like watching a thief parade around in stolen clothes. I sat with the paper in my lap, bitterness twisting in my chest. My silence had been my protection, but they were using that silence to rewrite history. My mother's version of events had become fact. Aviana was the star, and I was the shadow that had conveniently disappeared. History is written by those who show up, I whispered to myself. My sister had shown up in the newspaper, smiling for cameras, while I hid behind ledgers and plants. But hiding wouldn't do anymore. If I wanted to reclaim my story, I had to make myself undeniable. Despite the sting, I doubled down on my vow. I poured myself into the plant revival project that had become my secret salvation. Every free inch of my apartment filled with pots. The balcony sagged under the weight of greenery. Neighbors passing below looked up in surprise at the jungle forming above them. Each thriving plant was a chapter I was reclaiming from the book my family had stolen. Their headlines could paint Aviana as the golden child, but I was building something they could not erase. They had their headlines, I told myself, running a hand over a leaf that had unfurled under my care. I will build my legacy. And just when I thought I could stay invisible forever, the truth about my family's lies came crashing back to me. The summer of 2015 carried with it a milestone I had dreamed of since the day my mother's scissors sliced me from the family photo. After years of shared rooms and borrowed couches, I finally signed a lease for my own one-bedroom apartment. The manager slid the keys across the counter, and for a moment I just stared at them, afraid to breathe. My name was written clearly on the paperwork, no one else's. I threaded the key onto a thin chain and slipped it around my neck. It wasn't jewelry, it was freedom. A constant reminder that I had carved out a place that couldn't be revoked with a single cruel word. This wasn't just a door to an apartment, I whispered to myself as I unlocked it for the first time. It's a door out of the past. I stepped into the modest space, scuffed hardwood floors, a balcony no bigger than a closet, and walls that needed paint. But the emptiness felt like possibility. My mother's voice echoed in memory. You'll never make it without us. Yet here I was, turning the key, proving her wrong with every turn of the lock. In this country, adulthood often begins with your name on a lease. That scrap of paper meant I had crossed that line. On the day I signed, I pulled from my closet the thrift store dress my mother once mocked, the very one I had worn at graduation when she whispered her venom. I wore it deliberately, buttoning it with care. This time, neighbors and coworkers noticed me differently. That color suits you, one cashier said when I stopped for groceries. At the shop, a customer smiled and said, "Sharp look, Charlene." The dress hadn't changed. I had. That evening, I invited 2 friends from work for a small housewarming. We sat cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout Chinese from paper cartons, the sweet and sour scent filling the room. Laughter echoed off the bare walls, and I realized that joy didn't need a dining set or crystal glasses. It lived in the company of people who showed up for you. When the night ended, I hung the dress on a hook by the door, not as clothing, but as a banner. A reminder that what was once used to shame me had become my armor of pride. It's not what you're called, I told myself quietly as I closed the door. It's what you answer to. W.C. Field's words rang true in a way I had never understood before. A week later, I received a call from Cordelia, my father's sister, who lived only a few blocks away. She had kept her distance during the chaos of my exile, torn between family loyalty and her own sense of truth. "Come by," she said softly. "There's something I need to tell you." I walked to her modest home, my stomach tight with curiosity. She poured tea, her hands trembling slightly, and then slid a photo across the table. It was from my graduation. In it, I stood stunned, diploma in hand, while my mother leaned in, her lips curled in a harsh whisper. The shock on my face was frozen forever in that frame. They've been telling people you walked away, that you were unstable, that you left on your own, Cordelia said, her eyes glistening. But I was there, Charlene. I saw her humiliate you, and I can't let you carry their lies as if they were truth. I held the photo in my hands, my throat closing. My mother hadn't just abandoned me. She had rewritten the story, stealing my narrative and handing out a forgery. It wasn't just neglect, I murmured, more to myself than to her. It was narrative theft. She rewrote my story while I was still living it. Cordelia reached across the table, her voice firm. Don't let them keep the pen. Write your own. Walking home with that photo, I felt a mix of pain and vindication. For years, I had carried shame like a burden strapped to my back. But in that moment, I knew it had never been mine to bear. The shame belonged to them. Back in my apartment, surrounded by pots of thriving plants, I whispered to myself, if they erased me, I'll write myself back, bigger than ever. The truth didn't free me instantly. It lit a fire under me. Sometimes the truth isn't gentle. It's gasoline on an already smoldering flame. I pulled out my journal and wrote, they can tell their lies. I'll build my truth. One plant, one step, one room of my own at a time. And I knew then, my small balcony garden would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something they could never silence. The truth Cordelia had shown me, the photo, the whispered lies, the confirmation that my erasure was intentional, sat heavy in my chest for weeks. Betrayal carried a different weight than humiliation. Humiliation was sharp and immediate, a wound that stung in the moment. Betrayal, though, settled deep, like a stone lodged under the skin that you could never quite remove. My family hadn't just turned their backs on me. They had rewritten me, reshaping me into someone unrecognizable to protect their own fragile image. Being forgotten hurts, but being replaced in your own story, that breaks something deeper. In America, I'd learned, estrangement wasn't only about slammed doors or raised voices. It was about silence, false narratives spun behind closed lips until lies hardened into history. Every time I passed a neighbor who nodded politely, I wondered what version of me they carried in their heads. Did they believe I was unstable? Did they think I had chosen to walk away? I felt anger rising, a molten weight in my gut, but I had learned enough to know that bitterness corrodes the vessel that holds it. I refused to let their poison become my identity. If they wanted me to be the shadow, I would become the fire that cast it. That fall, I carried a revived plant in my hands and made my way to the cemetery. My father's grave was modest, the lettering beginning to weather. I knelt in the grass and set the pot down gently beside the headstone. The plant had been near death when I first brought it home. Now it stood green and firm, roots gripping the soil like it belonged. "Dad," I whispered, brushing dirt from the engraved letters. "You once told me, you'll do great things, kid. Don't let anyone dim that." The memory brought a lump to my throat. If you had been alive, maybe I wouldn't have been erased. But you left me the one thing no one could take away, your belief in me. I spoke as though he were still alive, confessing how hard it had been, how lonely, how I'd failed and started over again. And then I told him about my small wins, the apartment with my name on the lease, the balcony crowded with thriving plants, the journal full of promises I hadn't broken. Placing the plant at his grave felt symbolic. Proof that both it and I had survived being discarded. Proof that neglect wasn't the same as death. In America, visiting graves isn't only about mourning. It's about dialogue with the past, a ritual of finding strength in what remains. As I stood up, brushing grass from my knees, I felt lighter. My father was gone, but he remained my anchor. Even in death, he steadied me. A few days later, a different kind of weight arrived. I opened my email one morning and found a message from a cousin I barely knew, someone who hadn't spoken to me in years. "I heard you're still struggling," the note began, blunt and cruel. "Maybe your mom was right about you." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Their words weren't new. They were recycled gossip, stones thrown from afar by people who never lifted a hand to help. That was the nature of family cruelty. Effortless to dish out, impossible to erase. For a moment, shame threatened to seep in again. But then I closed my eyes, inhaled, and made a choice. Their cruelty was recycled gossip, thrown at me like pebbles, and I decided I wouldn't bleed for it anymore. I didn't reply. I deleted the email, a quiet act of defiance. For the first time, I refused to internalize their poison. "You can't control what people say about you," I wrote in my journal that night, "but you can control what you choose to believe." So I turned my attention back to the things that truly mattered, the living reminders of resilience in my apartment. My plants multiplied, their greens stretching into every corner. Each one I saved gave me a strange hope, a reminder that survival was resistance. I began volunteering at a community garden downtown, pulling weeds beside retirees, single mothers, and young kids learning to plant tomatoes. As my hands dug into the soil, I felt something shift. Pain became fuel. Loneliness became purpose. Every root that clung to life reminded me, survival is resistance. Soon, my apartment resembled a greenhouse. Pots filled windowsills, floors, and counters. It wasn't clutter, it was sanctuary, a place where whispers from the outside couldn't reach me. I sensed it then. This sanctuary wasn't just a refuge. It was the seed of something larger. I didn't yet know what shape it would take, but I felt it stirring beneath the surface. Bitterness was heavy. Hope made me lighter. The day I signed the papers for the mansion in Shaker Heights, I felt the universe shift beneath my feet. For years I had walked past those manicured lawns and grand colonial facades, a silent outsider looking in. I had wondered what it might be like to live behind one of those tall oak doors, to walk marble foyers and sip coffee on balconies that overlooked rows of maples. And now here I was, pen in hand, my name flowing across documents that bound this house to me. The realtor handed me the key. It was heavier than the first apartment key I had kept on a chain years ago, the one that represented my shaky step into independence. This one felt like a crown. I slipped it into my palm and knew this wasn't just a house. It was proof that I had built a life they swore I would never touch. In America, ownership in a neighborhood like this isn't just real estate. It's status, stability, and a declaration of having arrived. When I first walked through the mansion, I let my fingers trail along the cool marble of the foyer. The garden outside stretched wide, room enough for every plant I had ever saved, and more. I pictured greenhouses, flowers filling the air with fragrance, a sanctuary built not from scraps, but from triumph. Driving through Shaker Heights that day, I couldn't help but remember the years I had passed these streets in envy. My old car rattled as I dreamed of belonging here. Now neighbors waved politely, no whispers, no stares. The contrast was almost unbearable. They dreamed it, I said to myself, pulling into the long driveway. I lived it. Inside, I placed my father's photo on the mantel in the study. The man who had believed in me when no one else did deserved the best seat in the house. Every decision, every vow scribbled into my journal, every plant revived on a cramped balcony had led to this moment. When I finally invited a few close friends for a housewarming, it wasn't the grand affair my sister Aviana would have hosted. No loud music, no gaudy decorations, just a handful of people sitting together with simple food, laughter echoing against walls that didn't need to prove anything. I thought of Albert Schweitzer's words, Success is not the key to happiness. Happiness is the key to success. For the first time, I understood the truth in them. A few weeks later, my phone rang. It was a reporter from the local paper, Azura, who had heard about my journey. She wanted to feature me in a piece about small businesses changing the community. At first, I hesitated. I had built my life quietly, deliberately away from the public eye. But something in her voice, curiosity, respect, convinced me to say yes. When the article came out, the headline blazed across the page, "From Motel to Mansion, One Woman's Journey of Resilience." The story detailed how I had taken discarded plants and turned them into a thriving business model, how sustainability and second chances weren't just buzzwords, but the foundation of my life. I gave her a line I had carried with me for years. I wasn't discarded. I was replanted. The article spread. Readers wrote in, calling me an inspiration, a role model for second chances. Messages came from people I had never met, single mothers, laid-off workers, seniors starting over in their 60s, thanking me for reminding them it wasn't too late. But across town, my mother scoffed. I heard from a cousin that Dimity had waved the article in front of relatives and said, "The media exaggerates. She just got lucky." Her dismissal no longer cut me the way it once would have, because this time, the story wasn't confined to whispers in kitchens or rumors in church pews. The whole city had read it, and no matter how she spun her lies, the truth was louder than her contempt. One evening, I sat on the balcony of the mansion, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The lights of the house glowed gently against the twilight. I thought of the motel room, the scissors snip through my photo, the whispered lies that had defined me for years. Triumph sat beside sorrow. I wished my father could see this moment, wished he could walk the halls with me and smile at the garden I planned to build. Success hadn't erased the scars, but it had transformed them into power. "They erased me from the family album," I said softly into the night air. "But now the whole city writes my story." The mansion's windows reflected the light back into the darkness, a beacon of the identity I had reclaimed. Yet even in that peace, I knew the story wasn't over. My family had a way of returning when they thought there was something to gain, and I felt it then, like a shadow at the edge of the glow, the inevitability of their knock at my door. The morning was quiet inside my mansion, the kind of silence I had once craved when every night in the shared house echoed with other people's footsteps. I sat in the study with a cup of coffee, light streaming in across the polished wood floors, reviewing notes for the expansion of my plant recovery business. My desk held my father's photograph, a plant I'd nursed back from the brink, and the journal that carried every vow I had whispered into its pages. For once, my thoughts felt still. Then came the sharp chime of the doorbell. It echoed through the marble foyer, startling in its boldness. Few people arrived without calling ahead. I stood, coffee still warm in my hand, and walked to the heavy oak doors. When I pulled them open, the sight before me nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. On the porch stood my mother, Dimity, her posture as rigid as it had been at my graduation. Beside her was my sister Aviana, polished and smiling faintly. A few cousins lingered behind, faces I hadn't seen in over a decade. They all looked older, worn, but the familiarity struck me harder than their wrinkles. Disbelief coursed through me. After 12 years of silence, after cutting me out with the coldness of a surgeon, they had shown up uninvited at the threshold of the life they swore I'd never have. The mansion I built was my sanctuary. To them, it was an invitation. The oak doors that once shielded me now stood like a thin barrier between my peace and the ghosts of my past. My mother spoke first, her lips curling into a practiced smile. "We thought it was time to be a family again." Her words dripped with artificial sweetness, but her eyes betrayed calculation. Aviana stepped forward, letting her gaze sweep across the foyer. This place is stunning, Charlene. Much too big for one person, don't you think? She ran her hand across the doorframe as though she were already moving in. Every word was a test. Would I rage? Would I fall back into the trembling girl they once exiled? I steadied myself, choosing silence. I had learned long ago that silence could cut sharper than screams. They entered without waiting for permission. Dimity's voice carried through the halls as she admired the chandeliers. It's beautiful, darling. Truly, we've had time to reflect, and we realize perhaps we handled things poorly back then. Handled things poorly. That was her revision of betrayal. As Aviana strolled into the living room, her eyes fell on the framed photos of my work. Plants, awards, newspaper clippings. She picked one up, feigning pride. Impressive. Who would have thought you'd turn this into something so successful? Their apologies weren't stitched with remorse, but with entitlement. It wasn't regret that brought them here. It was hunger, the kind of hunger that noticed the size of my rooms, the sweep of my garden, the weight of my success. In America, estranged families rarely return for love. And they return when they smell stability, wealth, status. I let them talk, let them fill the air with their thinly veiled flattery. Then I cut through it. You erased me for 12 years, and now you show up here? Dimity stiffened. We were under pressure. You misunderstood. No, I interrupted, my voice level, deliberate. I understood perfectly. I was humiliated on stage by my own mother. You cut me out of photographs, out of gatherings, out of your life, and you did it with intent. The words landed like stones in the room. My sister shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Truth, delivered without emotion, stings sharper than any scream. On the coffee table lay my journal, its cover worn from years of use. I let my hand rest on it, silent testimony of every vow I had kept since the day they discarded me. I looked at them steadily. This house is mine. My life is mine. You don't get to walk back in as if nothing happened. Dimity's face tightened. Charlene, we're family. Surely you can find it in your heart. Family doesn't exile their own and then come back when the house is big enough, I said, my tone cutting like glass. You are not welcome here unless you are ready to face the truth of what you did. Forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's surrender. And I'm done surrendering. The room fell silent. My words hung heavy in the air, undeniable. I walked to the door and opened it wide. It's time you leave. Aviana's mouth opened as though to argue, but my stare silenced her. One by one, they shuffled out, their footsteps hesitant against the marble. As the last of them crossed the threshold, I closed the oak doors with deliberate finality. The sound echoed through the halls, sealing the past behind it. For the first time, I felt the power shift fully into my hands. They were the outsiders now. The reversal was complete. And still, I knew this was not the end. People who erase you once often return when they think you've forgotten, and I was certain they would be back. The air inside the mansion felt different that evening, thick with the weight of unsaid words. My estranged family had gathered under the pretense of a discussion, though I knew better. Their smiles were masks stretched too tight, their gestures rehearsed. Years of silence had not been broken for love. I had learned to read hunger behind courtesy, and tonight their hunger was palpable. It was the same weekend Aviana hosted her grand birthday party, splashed across social media with glittering lights, expensive dresses, and guests raising champagne glasses. Her captions boasted of legacy, of family pride. In contrast, my own gathering had been quiet, 2 true friends, a simple meal, and laughter that came without strings. The juxtaposition said it all. Noise does not equal love, and silence does not equal weakness. I watched them as they settled uneasily into my living room, the glow of the fireplace throwing shadows against the walls. My mother's eyes flicked over the chandeliers, the furniture, the framed clippings of my story. Aviana perched on the edge of a velvet chair, scrolling through her phone as though comparing her staged celebration to the reality she now sat in. The storm was about to break, and I was ready. I stood and walked to the television, remote in hand. "There's something you need to see." My voice was calm, almost soft, but I could see the way Dimity's smile faltered. With a click, the screen lit up. Grainy footage appeared. The old graduation video I had unearthed. The camera had captured the moment, me standing on the stage, diploma in hand, eyes wide with shock as my mother leaned forward, whispering venom. The humiliation was visible on my face, preserved forever. Gasps filled the room. A cousin's hand flew to her mouth. Aviana stiffened, her eyes darting to Dimity. For the first time in years, the lie they had woven began to unravel. My mother tried to speak. "It was a misunderstanding." "No." My voice cut clean through hers. "It was the truth you buried. And now it's out." Silence fell, heavy and unrelenting. The glow of the TV screen illuminated faces that had believed her narrative, now forced to confront its collapse. "For 12 years, I continued, my tone steady. You told the world I had walked away. Tonight, the world can see you pushed me." James A. Garfield's words echoed in my mind as I stared at her. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable." And misery was written all over her face. I let the footage play to the end, then switched off the screen. The room was darker now, but the truth lingered, undeniable. I walked to a drawer and pulled out something I had kept hidden for years, the graduation photo from which my image had been cut. But this time, it was restored. A friend had helped me reconstruct it, my face placed back where it belonged. I carried it to the main hall and hung it in a gilded frame. The sound of the nail tapping into the wall echoed like a gavel strike. "You can erase me from a picture," I said firmly, turning to face them, "but you cannot erase me from life." The younger cousins stared wide-eyed. I knelt slightly to meet their gaze. "Don't let anyone tell you your story isn't yours to tell. If they try, you tell it louder." The silence in the room was no longer dismissive. It was reverent, unsettled. They knew, perhaps for the first time, that the power had shifted permanently. I straightened and looked directly at my mother. "You are not welcome in my life until you can admit what you did. Not half-truths, not excuses, accountability. Without it, this door is closed." Dimity's face hardened, but she said nothing. Aviana's eyes brimmed with something between shame and defiance. I opened the great oak door once more. "This house is mine. This life is mine. You may leave now." One by one, they shuffled out, heads lowered. For years I had been the exile. Tonight, they were. As the last relative crossed the threshold, I shut the door with steady hands. This time, the sound didn't sting. It didn't ache. It felt like liberation. Closure doesn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes it means locking the door and keeping the key. I turned back into the mansion, the lights glowing warmly across polished floors. My plants thrived in every corner, symbols of survival and rebirth. I wasn't done building. I wasn't done rising. George Herbert's words came to me as I stood in the quiet. Living well is the best revenge. And I finally understood them, not as a phrase, but as truth. Revenge wasn't about destroying them, it was about never letting them destroy me again.